Well, thanks to everybody who listened to my last podcast episode, Make the Wind Speak, Buffalo's Unwilling Ezra Pound. If you somehow haven't listened to that and ended up here by accident, please do go back and listen to it, because this episode won't make any sense. The response was great, though, really exciting. I had some good feedback, some corrections. I'll talk about that in a minute. And in particular, I want to thank Joe Finnerty, who actually kicked off this podcast producing phase of my long-running investigation, when a couple months ago I thought to ask him if he had ever heard of Anonym and Mark Robeson. At that time, I wasn't really actively looking into this. I had let these threads drop a long time ago, but I knew that Joe and I had a mutual interest in publishing in modernist poetry, and Ezra Pound in particular, and I thought to ask him. He didn't know about Anonym or Mark Robeson, but that conversation inspired me to get back to work and produce what you all heard recently. On that note, I think I've found that the podcast form of storytelling, as opposed to the sort of writing that I'm used to, just lends itself to an ongoing project or an ongoing conversation. Maybe that's obvious. I think my own feeling on that is very much influenced by Blind Boy and his fabulous podcast, Blind Boy Boat Club, recorded out of his home in Limerick. He's described his podcast that's been running now since, I believe, 2017 as a novel, and he's revisited many of the topics he touches on again and again and again, kind of iterating on them, changing them slightly. You can watch his thinking evolve. Scholarly research, I think, is the same in some respects, but in the podcast form, it feels particularly fluid, and I can so easily come back and correct myself. So, for example, I erroneously stated that St. Elizabeth's Hospital was outside of Washington, D.C., and another Joe Hassett, pointed out to me that it's actually in Washington, D.C., and essentially the search continues. That's just an example of an error, but there's so much more to discover, particularly about these Pound publications, the drafts and fragments, the piracies that we discussed. On that note, I also want to thank Bob Spoo and Josh Coten, who spent a really long time with me generously in conversation on these topics. And much of what we talked about just didn't fit the main narrative that I wanted to relay in that other episode. But they were really great byways and detours, and I didn't want to let that conversation go to waste. So that's what I'm presenting today in this shorter bonus episode. A couple excerpts from that longer conversation that touch on some interesting areas. We talk first about the idea of the cantos as a poem of incarceration. We also talk about, in more detail, Sherry Martinelli. We talk about ideas of piracy and the kind of cachet that attached to piracy around the Ed Sanders period, and many other topics. So I hope you enjoy this.
I was having a discussion earlier this week with the scholar named Stephen Meyer, who wrote a really impressive book about Gertrude Stein a while ago, and we were talking about the P's and Cantos, and he's not a Poundian, doesn't really like Pound, but really admires the P's and Cantos, and has a whole kind of theory about why the P's and Cantos are so great. And part of it is the constraints that Pound had on him in the detention center, and how the context really undermined his agency. And, we can really think about piracy as connecting with various forms of compromised agency or compromised authority. So we can kind of connect, even the late piracy or this reception of drafts and fragments, trace it back to the P's and Cantos, and how, Pound, before the P's and Cantos, the writing was already kind of perforated with the voices of others. And, Cantos begins with Pound coming across, I guess, a 16th century translation of the Odyssey by Dives on the quays, at a Bouquiniste on the quays in Paris. And just that chance encounter is what sets off this grand poem. And it's so important that it's a chance encounter. So, Cantos are always very interested in kind of being perforated by the voices of others and by chance, but it really gets escalated in this kind of post-war moment. And that's something I hadn't really thought about before talking to Stephen, is that is that connection between the impact of others on this and a contingency. So interested in contingency, I guess that's the way to put it. From the very, very beginning, from the first canto, that Pound thinks that this epic has to involve contingency. And it's almost the idea of the paraplum that he has from that period, where the two differences between the map as viewed from the a bird's eye view, the objective representation of the territory, and the paraplum, which is the map from the eye of the sailor as they're touring around the coast. And that idiosyncratic individual perspective actually offers a more truthful account of reality and the world than the so-called objective map does. So a real kind of, the cantos is almost tracing a history of different forms of contingency, and it's almost inevitable that piracy would have to be involved toward the end of it.
Yeah. The whole idea too, when you think of the last three completed collections of cantos, Pisen, Rock Drill, Thrones, are all poems of incarceration. And to what extent does the incarcerated life inflect the building and the completing of a poem? In many ways, your life is not your own. Your decisions are not fully your own. It's much harder to do things. And in a sense, the poem is kind of taken away from you in certain respects. You may generate it in notebooks sitting in St. Elizabeth's, but it gets harder. Certainly, the scholarship of Ron Bush and others on the Pisen canto shows that poem is really a poem of contingency in many ways, not just that it was created in a tent in an army camp and so forth, but other ways. And it's also strange thinking of the poem ending with Thrones and ending with that was it 109? Would it have been? A poem, a very legal poem, very legalistic poem about Sir Edward Coke and this strange statute that has to do with cottagers. I don't think anybody's read, even come close to reading that the legal dimension correctly of that. As far as I understand that statute, it's a statute about protecting the commons, oddly, because commons existed, in this period, 16th century, 16th, 17th century, various kinds of commons that, we know the enclosure of the commons and all that. And the commons was under threat, partly because of the building of private cottages. And that if they were built too close together, people would be forced out onto the commons to steal or to collect kindling and other stuff. But the statute requires a certain space, like around the cottages, so the cottages can have their own kindling. So in other words, it's a pro-commons poem, which is very interesting that it would have ended that way. It ended with a kind of pro-commons poem. Instead, it ends, the cantos do, with a poem of piracy, the product of piracy, or very much shaped by a history of piracy and copyright problems. In a sense, the way I think of piracy is also sort of about the commons.
Yeah. Again, it ends with 120. Let the wind speak. And that's kind of giving up or active abandonment to the authority of another, or to a world in which there is no authority. It's just kind of natural causes.
We also talked at some length about Ezra Pound's anti-Semitism, which on its face may seem like one of the most studied and discussed aspects of the totality of Ezra Pound. Certainly it came up in the previous podcast episode, in comments by Robert Creeley and some other areas. But Bob and Josh went deeper on the issue of Pound's anti-Semitism, whether it was suburban, as he allegedly characterized it late in life, or actually urban, even urbane, and just to what degree the feelings about Pound's anti-Semitism among some of the actors in the piracy and small press publishing drama, Ed Sanders, Robert Creeley, Charles Olson, Allen Ginsberg, to what degree this anti-Semitism influenced them toward these acts of renegade publishing?
You think of Ginsberg and the famous story, of visiting Pound. And Pound finally is somehow moved to make this remark about that stupid suburban prejudice of anti-Semitism. At least that is what we have in the telling. And Ginsberg says, it is lovely to hear you say that. This is finally Pound speaking something that Ginsberg had wanted to hear. And it's in this paradisal vein of acknowledgement of error, of apology, kind of confession, and sort of Ginsbergian absolution. The other person that I look to for that is Olson himself, because when you think of Olson was one of the very first people to get contact with Pound after he returned to the United States in 1945, or been returned to the United States. Pound is in, I don't know if he didn't visit him even at DC jail or something before he got to St. Elizabeth. Certainly in the very early days of St. Elizabeth, Olson is there visiting. And that account that Olson published of his very, very vivid memories of that are absolutely indispensable for catching a very raw Pound at that moment. I think actually supporting some of the view that Pound at that point was not mentally stable in that moment, and but also wanting Pound to speak in a certain way. Olson is charmed and enchanted and moved by many of the things Pound says. Pound can be very witty. Pound can be very profound in this kind of caged atmosphere. But then all of a sudden Pound starts saying things that Olson cannot abide. All of a sudden the authoritarianism, the anti-Semitism, the fascism come roaring out of Pound, and Olson stops his visits, and that's the account ends. This would be an opportunity. I mean, I'm offering a gloss in case it is Olson and it is Ginsberg sort of involved. They want Pound now to speak exactly this way. They long for this message, for this voice.
Yeah, and like Lauchlin's letters of the period, this is the greatest gift that could ever be given to Lauchlin. Like, he's so happy with Ginsberg and so happy with his report, and sees it both redeeming Pound, but also creating a market for Pound that didn't exist before because of the hurdle of his anti-Semitism. I've always been struck by the fact that it gets Pound's anti-Semitism completely wrong, and I'm shocked that Ginsberg would have been, happy with it. Right? It's Pound's anti-Semitism is anything but a suburban prejudice. Right? It's an incredibly urban prejudice, and it's an incredibly sophisticated one. Obviously, wrong and horrible, but it's not the kind of chauvinism of the, simple country folk who have never met a Jew before. And it's a total, cop out. So I've always been surprised. Like, I'm not surprised Lauchlin loved it, but I'm surprised that Ginsberg is what Ginsberg wanted. And I would love for someone to do, a study of Ginsberg's diaries from that time, and to kind of get a sense of the stakes of that comment.
That anti-Semitism of Pound's is much closer than anybody wanted to admit, like Ginsberg, to the kind of virulent European anti-Semitism you see in the protocols.
Exactly.
And it's no wonder that Pound actually endorsed the protocols in his radio talks, if nowhere else.
Correct. Yeah. No, that's exactly right.
On a lighter note, I do want to make another correction at this point. in the previous episode, I said that I was not able to get in touch with Ed Sanders. That was true at the time of the recording, but Ed Sanders did actually respond to one of my emails while I was working on the podcast, and I just didn't update that little snippet of audio. So my bad, Ed. In my defense, though, Sanders was not terribly helpful. Our very short email correspondence ended with Sanders saying, "I have no further information." And my follow-up email to that goes unanswered to this day. That's fine. I will allow Ed to protect whatever he wants to protect for whatever reasons. It's all kind of amusing to me, to be honest. Almost as amusing as this anecdote from Josh about Sanders' reverence for Charles Olson.
Sanders, revered Olson. In the Sanders papers, which are now at Princeton, Sanders attended Olson's famous talk at Berkeley in the 65 Poetry Conference. And, famously at that talk, almost everyone in the audience left because Olson's kept going and going and going and going and going. And I think there's some pretty funny comments from Duncan about that talk. But Sanders stayed till the end and retrieved Olson's bottle of Cutty Sark, that he had drained, a little pint bottle or a pint bottle of Cutty Sark, and that bottle is still in the Sanders papers.
Wow.
So
which had fueled the long flight.
Yeah, exactly. I was with students, you could kind of Jurassic Park it. You could, still pull Olson's DNA off that bottle and
wow,
recreate him.
I shared in the main podcast why I didn't think that Sherry Martinelli was the source of Anonym's Canto 120. But Martinelli is a really, really interesting figure and deserving of so much more attention than we were able to give her in that short podcast. So here's another brief discussion of Sherry Martinelli. Well, I know we've almost come up on an hour. I want to be respectful of your time, but I do want to ask and spend a little bit of time on one character we haven't talked about yet who maybe doesn't share the same motivations or beliefs about Pound as Allen Ginsberg and Charles Olson, and that is Sherry Martinelli, whose name comes up, I think, just because of the use of the fox to attribute Canto 120 in Anonym. Can you tell me a little bit about Sherry Martinelli, relationship with Pound, and how she fits into this sort of moment of the mimeograph revolution and piracy?
I'm going to pass that baton to you, Bob.
Well, I don't know that I can link her up to Anonym any more than Laughlin tried to do by saying, who would call him the Fox? The pseudonym of the Fox. Well, that sounds like Martinelli. I don't even know if it does. That's what he thought. So I guess maybe she had used phrases like that about Pound. They all got letters from Martinelli, so they were familiar with her voice. Pound, Martinelli gets kind of pushed out of the Pound orbit at St. Elizabeth's, largely in favor of Marcella Spann. They feel very much in competition, and finally, I don't know exactly what Pound said, but he finally kind of brushed Martinelli out, and Marcella takes the place, and she's the one who comes to Italy with him and Dorothy, stays for a good year at least, I think, in there. Drafts and Fragments is very much about her, and in some ways to her. Would it be impossible that Martinelli would want to wrest back some of that muse status by maybe assembling a little poem and putting the Fox's name on it? I don't know. These are all speculations, not answering your question, but those are kind of my quick reactions to that.
Maybe can I share? I have some concerns about the timing of that theory, and I also may be misunderstanding something, so I wanted to share this with you. The idea that Robeson from Anonym got Canto 120 from Martinelli, I think the first problem I have with that is all of the lines that appear in Canto 120 were part of the draft of 115 as it was published in Threshold in Belfast in 1962. This would have been, I think, after Martinelli was, as you said, pushed out of the orbit of Pound. Maybe she was corresponding or something, but if the draft of 115 included all those lines, that suggests to me they didn't exist in some other form hanging out on their own. Because if you listen to the Spoleto recordings from, I think, 67, Pound reads another draft of 115 and all of these lines are removed. Maybe he wrote them down somewhere else. Maybe he, struck them out. As you said, maybe somebody else collaged them into 120. But I think the beginning of Canto 120's creation probably happens in between 62 and 67 because of these iterations of 115. So that suggests Martinelli didn't have it. The other problem I have with this is, how would Martinelli have encountered Mark Robeson, who was a very young graduate student who only arrived in Buffalo in 1967? And then the last maybe missing bit of info here is his son, Tyler, told me that he definitely would have pirated 120, produced it without Pound's permission, although he does claim that he got Pound's permission in a letter to Lachlan, because that's just the kind of guy he was. He wanted his magazine to sort of be notorious. He wanted people to pick it up. It sort of has clout and cachet on the Buffalo campus, which was teeming with people, at that point who he might have wanted to impress. If he had possession of Canto 120 in 1967 when he arrived, he would have put it out in issue number 1. But he puts it out in issue number 4. It just isn't consistent with the man his son remembers to sit on it for that long.
Yeah, so that seems to be an important piece of information, and I don't know how reliable that assumption is. I kind of defer to you on that. Like, that seems to be a lot hinges on that. Like, if he would have published it immediately when he had it, then that a lot of implications to that, right?
But how also would he have received it from Martinelli, who at that point was living in California?
I actually don't know a huge amount about Martinelli, and not invested in the Martinelli as being the conduit for it. The people to talk to about Martinelli would be, I think Greg Barnheisel is thinking about writing a biography of Martinelli, who has a fascinating life, of which Pound is only a small part. Her relationship with Gaddis, with Bukowski. There's a interesting history there. And then Alec Marsh, who's a Pound scholar in Pennsylvania, and then Michael Candellin, who's a Pound scholar who lives in Berlin, but it teaches at Sheffield in England. Those would be the 3 people that might know the most about her. Maybe Barnheisel most of all, but Marsh and Candellin as well.
One of the more interesting pieces of evidence we discussed was the appearance of copyright notices in these questionable publications. In the case of Anonym, that was a copyright notice actually printed on the copyright page. And in the case of the earlier Niagara Frontier Review, these were copyright notices seemingly stamped after the fact on the pages where Pound's poems appeared. This led Bob, Josh, and me into a really interesting conversation about copyright, piracy, and infamy.
I like Bob's account of this is evidence that maybe Pound was involved. To my mind, not having the same background or the same set of references, what I immediately thought of was this is an allusion to Sanders. That publication had already blown up. It'd become lore in Robeson's world and Sanders's world that Ed was beckoned to the, wherever he was beckoned to have lunch with the Russian tea room, to have lunch with Lachlan, that he was threatened. Piracy was such, and Bob will confirm this and elaborate on it, was such a mechanism of marketing at this time that these very small, basically bankrupt, financially bankrupt publications, the way they get attention was to be accused of piracy or to draw attention to the fact that what they were doing might be suspect, or, so I could see Robertson playing with that, right? Again, going back to, City Lights, Chicago Review, Floating Bear, Fuck You Press. These are all underground publications that made it into the New York Times by being suppressed by the government or accused of piracy. So kind of legal shenanigans was a promotional tool. So, whether Anonym was interested in that. And again, whether I would love to get an account of the stamp. I actually haven't seen it in the Niagara Frontier Review of whether that happened because Lachlan complained. So someone went through all the remaining issues. And again, having worked for Literary Journal, you know that, you print 1,000 copies or 500 copies or whatever. You live a long time with 300 copies next to your desk.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be that ridiculous to kind of stamp them all. And that journal in particular, I always take the secondary market as evidence of how it's circulated. It's fairly inexpensive to get a run of Niagara Frontier Review to this day, meaning that they didn't circulate as much as you might have thought they did. That's definitely true of the Fuck You Press Cantos, that a huge number went unsold. And this is what the census revealed. A lot of them remained in the overstock of the Phoenix Bookshop and of Gotham Book Mart. And, till as recently 10 years ago, you could get big batches of them fairly inexpensively. So that would be another kind of explanation, that there was some kind of word from Lachlan, and then someone went through with a stamp and tried to fix a problem that they hadn't anticipated. But also, you can imagine it lending it an air of authenticity, right? Almost like this has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize sticker that goes on. It's a kind of the touch of the poet, that to say this is Ezra Pound's brings some kind of aura of Ezra Pound into the fabric of the material object.
And Lachlan too would have known exactly that wisdom that I'm talking about, the copyright wisdom of putting a separate notice on the thing. He didn't always enforce it or urge it with magazines.
You may recall that I spent some time discussing what I believe to be an act of revision in the late cantos. Namely, that what we now know to be Canto 120 comprises lines that appeared in an earlier than edited draft of Canto 115. But is this consistent with the kind of revision that we know Ezra Pound practiced? The answer to that question may actually help determine the authenticity of 120.
I know a lot about Pound, but I don't know enough. And maybe Kendallin would have an answer to this, but how often did Pound rearrange his own work to find a new work? Like, was his practice was to, like a lot of poets, this is true for, where they will write a poem and then rearrange the lines to find a better poem? My sense is Pound didn't do that, but again, I could be, maybe Bob, that answer to that question. That was he really kind of searching for good lines and then putting them almost like an erasure, like he was making an erasure of his own work. And I connect that very much to a writing practice that has really obviously goes back to Dada and the cut up, but I think it really takes root institutionally in the age of creative writing programs, where editing becomes much more mechanical than it ever had come before, because you have teachers trying to find poems in the work of their students. So that would be a question I would want to answer too. Like, did Pound write like this? Is this the fingerprint of Pound to find a poem in his cast off material, or was someone else doing this for him?
The great example would be what Pound says about In a Station of the Metro.
Yes,
where he takes a very long, rambling,
correct,
comparatively, poem about this experience that he had in the Paris Metro, and he distills it finally down to 2 lines, and he talks about it, shrinking the poem bit by bit down.
Yeah,
and this would be a similar kind of shrinking, but it'd also be a reassemblage. But it's to me it's so pat. It's they're making the wind speak, collectively, and this would be the ideal speaking of the wind.
Yeah,
of that wind that they wanted to hear.
It's almost too good to be true, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
No, I like that.
While I still don't know which poems passed through which hands, leading to the contested publications of Niagara Frontier Review and Anonym, I did lay out to Bob and Josh my theory as to the prevailing attitudes that made these publications possible. This led Bob to reflect on the feeling around Pound late in his life that he needed to speak in a way that would redeem his poetry and, I might add, maybe even redeem these individuals' interests in him.
I don't know the answers to the questions you're raising about, who orchestrated all this. Cook did precede Olson in coming there, but I think they all had a role to play. I mean, to me, taking a step back from this whole inquiry, I started out just sort of narrowly thinking about who actually gave the manuscripts to these editors, Sanders, Robeson, and I still don't really know the answer to that. I think I've maybe narrowed the field a little bit, but the other interesting question is who gave them their specific ideas about, as Bob, you said, what Pound ought to be saying.
Yeah.
I think then very obviously the answer is Ginsberg and Olson, both of whom were,
Yeah.
you use the word revered, I mean, by Sanders, definitely, and by Mark Robeson from Anonym, definitely, and by Harvey Brown from Niagara Frontier Review.
There is a rather massive conspiracy of selectivity at this moment that Pound needs to be edited. I mean, they might have given the title of Drafts and Fragments. Instead of that, they might have, Confessions of a Former Anti-Semite, which is kind of the way this was being presented. As Pound has reached his, first of all, he's recovered his lyrical voice, and he's giving it to us instead of in spezzato, tiny bits and pieces. He's giving it to us pretty much full force in Drafts and Fragments. We're getting more. As it were, pound for pound, we're getting more lyrical moments in Drafts and Fragments than anywhere else per capita in the cantos. But it's still a selection, and this is partly a worry about that Pound's career needs to be managed, that Pound's final poetic voice needs to be shaped, and it's not as though he'd given these views up. I mean, late into the St. Elizabeth's period, at least, he's still writing these ghastly letters to Olivia Agresti. I mean, they're very unpleasant letters. They're very, disappointing that he would cling to this with her, and even she's pushing back on this. It's both fascism and anti-Semitism that he's very strong on. This is a Pound that needs to be selected, and therefore both edited and maybe even pirated in order to make the selections.
Mm-hmm. Ezra Pound's life and works are filled with all kinds of coincidences and oddities. One of the ones that has long fascinated me that actually has nothing to do with Buffalo or this original inquiry is the appearance in Canto 74, this would be in the Pisan cantos, of Lewis Till, the father of Emmett Till, whose gruesome murder helped to ignite the civil rights movement. Pound and Till were imprisoned together by the American military in Pisa, where Pound wrote this sequence of cantos. I don't know if they were friends or even close acquaintances, but the appearance of Till in the poem years before the murder of his son, which would become of such enormous historical importance, is just odd and jarring. And I don't think I'm alone in noting some common feeling that Pound expresses in the poem. For another coincidence or luminous detail, I again have to thank Joe Finnerty, who, after my previous podcast came out, pointed out to me that the first book publication of cantos, that would be A Draft of 16 Cantos of Ezra Pound, subtitled For the Beginning of a Poem of Some Length, no kidding, appeared in 1925 from Three Mountains Press in Paris, which was the expatriate effort of one William Byrd, a journalist from Buffalo. This may have been Pound's first meaningful connection to that other city of light. Byrd founded Three Mountains Press in 1922, and only 1 year later recruited Ezra Pound to serve as an editor through their mutual friend Ford Maddox Ford. Pound's A Draft of 16 Cantos would then appear in 1925. This makes me think again of the draft of Canto 116, which first appeared in Niagara Frontier Review, edited by Charles Olson and published by Harvey Brown out of Buffalo in 1962. I didn't read very much of this poem in the original podcast. It begins, "Came Neptunus, his mind leaping like dolphins," which I absolutely love, but I want to draw your attention now to a passage a little bit later in the poem. Pound writes, "I have brought the great ball of crystal. Who can lift it? Can you enter the great acorn of light? But the beauty is not the madness, though my errors and wrecks lie about me. And I am not a demigod. I cannot make it cohere. If love be not in the house, there is nothing." I cannot make it cohere. This might encapsulate all of the drafts and fragments, these late incomplete cantos, up until the supposed Canto 120, which I think does cohere or try to make the entire effort cohere. whether or not Pound really stood by that or intended it. I cannot make it cohere. Well, I do find it just delightful that by bookending the Cantos project with the publication through Three Mountains in 1925 and the publication in Anonym number 4 in 1969, Buffalo, New York provided the structural coherence that Pound's project otherwise lacked. Thanks again for listening to Organizing Isolation, and the next episode, I promise, will not be about Ezra Pound.